In the sun-scorched valleys of Sierra Vista, where the rugged mountains of southern Arizona meet the Mexican border, a lone female farmer was about to teach the Serpientes Negras cartel a lesson in respecting American soil. When Miguel Vibera Ramirez and his enforcers arrived at Sarah Mitchell's struggling farm, they thought they were intimidating a helpless woman trying to protect her failing vineyard. They had no idea that Sarah was a former Army K-9 trainer who'd spent 15 years developing elite combat dogs for special forces operations, or that her 3 Belgian Malinois weren't just farm dogs. They were decorated combat veterans with more confirmed kills than most special operations teams. What began as a brutal attempt at forced land acquisition would unravel the largest cross-border smuggling operation in Arizona's history, as one woman's courage sparked a chain of events that would expose the cartel's deepest secrets. By sunset, the Serpientes Negras would learn why some farms are better left alone, and why working dogs don't always mean what you think. The morning sun painted long shadows across Sarah Mitchell's vineyard, the neat rows of grapevines stretching toward the distant mountains like soldiers standing at attention. The air carried the sweet scent of ripening fruit mixed with desert sage, a combination unique to this corner of Arizona where agriculture met wilderness. Sarah moved between the rows with practiced efficiency, her worn boots raising small clouds of dust as she checked irrigation lines. Around her, 3 Belgian Malinois worked their own patterns, their movements precise and coordinated. Atlas, the largest of the 3, patrolled the perimeter with military precision, his muscled frame moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Artemis, sleek and alert, monitored the eastern approach, where the farm road met the highway. Zeus, scarred but powerful, stayed closest to Sarah, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. To anyone passing by, they might have looked like typical farm dogs, albeit exceptionally well-trained ones. Their working vests, marked simply with "farm dog," gave no hint of their true capabilities. Maria Gonzalez, Sarah's closest neighbor and friend, pulled up in her battered pickup truck, the vehicle's approach already noted and cleared by Atlas's careful surveillance. "Sarah, the coffee's fresh, and I brought those chilaquiles you love," she called out, carrying a container and thermos. Her voice carried worry beneath its cheerful tone. Sarah smiled, brushing dirt from her hands as she approached. "Maria, you're a saint. These irrigation repairs are kicking my butt today." She noticed the concern in her friend's eyes. "What's wrong?" Maria's glance darted toward the road before she spoke. "The Vasquez family, they sold their farm yesterday. Not by choice, Sarah. Those men, the ones who've been offering to buy up all the border properties. They came back, but this time..." She didn't finish the sentence. Sarah's jaw tightened as Zeus moved closer to her side, picking up on her tension. The dog's posture shifted subtly from alert to combat ready, a change only his handler would notice. "How many families does that make now?" "4 in the last month. All the farms between here and the border." Maria's voice dropped lower. "They're saying the Serpientes Negras cartel is behind it, using legitimate businesses to launder money, but also," she glanced around again, "also to move other things across the border." Sarah watched Atlas adjust his patrol route, the dog's training allowing him to maintain security while appearing to simply explore the vineyard. She thought about the 15 years she'd spent training dogs like him, preparing them for the most dangerous military operations imaginable. How many times had she seen that same fluid movement in combat zones across the world? "They came to the Vasquez place at night," Maria continued. "Broke things, threatened the children. By morning, Roberto had signed the papers. Sarah, they'll come here too. Your farm, it's the last one on this stretch, the perfect location, Sarah finished. Direct road access to the border, isolated enough for privacy, but close enough to main routes for distribution. Her tactical mind, honed by years of military service, analyzed the situation automatically. They think they're just buying up vulnerable farms, but they're creating a corridor. Zeus suddenly stiffened, his ears forward, body coiled with combat-trained tension. Artemis and Atlas responded instantly, their positions shifting to cover specific angles of approach. Sarah heard it then, vehicles approaching, multiple engines, heavy ones. Maria, get inside. Call Sheriff Hayes, but tell him to stay back until I give the signal. These men, they're not just here to negotiate. Sarah's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd handled far worse situations. Sarah, there's too many of them. Everyone who's resisted. Maria's protest was cut short by the sound of vehicles pulling up at the farm's main entrance. Trust me, Sarah smiled, though her eyes were hard. They have no idea what they're walking into. She watched 3 black SUVs and 2 pickup trucks approach, their tinted windows hiding their occupants. Zeus maintained his position at her side, while Atlas and Artemis became seemingly invisible among the vineyard rows, their training allowing them to move without drawing attention. Miguel Vibora Ramirez stepped out of the lead SUV, his expensive boots raising dust as he approached. 5 more men emerged from the vehicles, their stances and movements betraying military training. Sarah noted their weapon prints beneath casual clothing, the way they spread out in a practiced formation. Miss Mitchell, Ramirez's voice carried, the false charm of a predator sizing up prey. I hope we're not interrupting your morning. I'm here to discuss a business opportunity that could solve all your financial difficulties. He glanced meaningfully at the aging farm equipment, the patches in the irrigation system. Sarah stood her ground, Zeus, a steady presence beside her. To Ramirez and his men, the dog might have looked like simple protection, a deterrent against trespassers. They couldn't know they were looking at a veteran of over 200 combat missions, a dog who'd led special forces teams through the deadliest regions on Earth. My farm isn't for sale, Mr. Ramirez. Sarah's voice remained steady. And I think you know that business opportunity isn't why you're really here. Ramirez's smile tightened. Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private. My associates can keep your dog company. 2 of his men moved forward, their hands drifting toward concealed weapons. Zeus didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply shifted his weight. A motion so subtle, only Sarah recognized it as the precursor to a combat engagement. Throughout the vineyard, Atlas and Artemis moved like shadows, their positions perfect for what was about to unfold. I've heard about your other negotiations, Sarah continued. The Vasquez family, the broken windows, the threats. You're not here to buy anything. You're here to take what you want. Ramirez's charm vanished. Then you understand how this works. Sign the papers, take the money, and everyone stays healthy. Refuse. He gestured, and his men spread out further, their intentions clear. Sarah almost smiled. They were positioning themselves exactly as she would have predicted, creating textbook attack angles that might work against civilians but had fatal flaws against trained opponents. They had no idea they were following a script she'd helped write during her years preparing dogs for exactly this type of confrontation. Last chance to make the smart choice, Ramirez warned. That mutt might scare off coyotes, but against professional men. He laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. Don't make us hurt it. Sarah's hand rested lightly on Zeus's head, feeling the coiled power in his frame. Around the vineyard, Atlas and Artemis waited for signals only they were trained to recognize. "Mr. Ramirez," she said quietly, "I think it's you who needs to make a choice. Leave now or learn why some women shouldn't be threatened and why working dogs aren't always what they seem." The morning sun climbed higher over Sierra Vista as years of training and experience converged in this moment. Neither Sarah nor her dogs had broken position, but something had changed in the farm's atmosphere. The coming hours would show everyone exactly why some veterans, human and canine, are best left in peace, and why appearances can be fatally deceiving. Ramirez's laugh cut through the morning air, but there was tension beneath his bravado. Something about the woman's confidence, the dog's unnaturally disciplined stance, had triggered warnings in his combat-trained mind. "You think when dog makes you brave? Let me show you what happens to brave women in this business." He snapped his fingers, and his men moved forward with practiced coordination. Sarah remained still, but her mind tracked their movements with tactical precision. Former military, she noted, probably Mexican special forces based on their formation patterns. The cartel recruited them specifically for operations like this. "Zeus, hold," she commanded quietly. The Belgian Malinois remained perfectly still, but his muscles were coiled steel beneath her fingers. To Ramirez's men, it might have looked like nervous obedience. To Sarah, it was a combat asset maintaining tactical control. Through the vineyard, Rose, Atlas and Artemis moved like ghosts, their positions shifting imperceptibly. Years of combat operations had taught them to become invisible until the moment of engagement. Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission focus settling over her, memories of countless training operations flooding back. "Miss Mitchell," Ramirez stepped closer, his expensive boots crunching on the gravel. "You're an intelligent woman. You see these men? They're professionals. Your little farm dog won't even have time to bark before—" A vehicle approaching from the main road interrupted him. Sarah recognized the engine sound. Sheriff Hayes's cruiser, but something was wrong with the timing. She'd told Maria to have him wait for her signal. Deputy Chief Roberts stepped out of the cruiser, and Sarah's tactical assessment shifted instantly. The way he nodded to Ramirez's men, the familiar way he approached. This wasn't intervention. This was collaboration. "Everything okay here, Sarah?" Roberts's tone carried false concern. "Mr. Ramirez has all the proper paperwork for a legal business transaction. No need to make this difficult." Zeus remained motionless, but Sarah felt his muscles tense further. The dog had done hundreds of operations against corrupt officials, could probably smell the betrayal on Roberts. Through the vineyard, Atlas and Artemis adjusted their positions, compensating for the new threat, proper paperwork. Sarah's voice carried controlled anger. "Like what the Vasquez family signed after you helped threaten their children." Roberts's face hardened. "Careful, Sarah. False accusations against a law enforcement officer, that's serious business." "Not as serious as what's really happening on these farms, is it?" Sarah watched Ramirez's men spread out further, trying to flank her position. Their movements were professional, coordinated, but they were following standard protocols for civilian engagement. They hadn't recognized the tactical situation they were really in. Maria's voice suddenly called from the farmhouse porch. "Sarah! Federal agents just pulled up at the Vasquez place. They're inside now." Sarah's command cut through the air. Maria ducked back into the house, just as Ramirez barked orders in Spanish. Two of his men started toward the farmhouse, but Sarah's quiet voice stopped them. "Zeus, guard." The change in the Belgian Malinois was instant and terrifying. Gone was the calm farm dog. In its place stood a combat veteran of hundreds of missions, his stance radiating lethal capability. The men froze, their instincts screaming warnings their conscious minds hadn't processed yet. "That's not just a farm dog, is it?" Ramirez's voice carried the first hint of uncertainty. His eyes narrowed, studying Zeus with new attention. "Military trained?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Something like that." "Kill it," Ramirez ordered. "Then show this brave woman what happens to the first man never completed his move toward his weapon." Zeus moved with explosive precision, years of combat training unleashing in controlled violence. The man went down hard, his weapon arm disabled with professional efficiency. Before the others could react, two more blurs of motion erupted from the vineyard. Atlas hit the second man from behind, a perfectly executed takedown that any special forces operator would recognize. Artemis materialized like a phantom, her attack, taking down two more men before they could draw their weapons. The coordination was flawless, each dog moving with tactical precision that spoke of hundreds of combat operations. Federal agents. A new voice cut through the chaos. Sarah recognized it instantly. Agent Elizabeth Carter, her former liaison during her years training dogs for military operations. "Everyone on the ground now!" Ramirez's remaining man reached for his weapon, but Zeus was already there. The Tsar dog moved with liquid efficiency, disarming him with a technique that Sarah had spent years perfecting with special forces teams. "These aren't just farm dogs," Carter approached, her weapon trained on Ramirez. "They're Operation Phantom veterans, highest mission success rate in Special Forces history." She smiled grimly. "And Sarah Mitchell isn't just a farmer. She spent 15 years developing the most effective combat dog training program the military has ever seen." Roberts tried to retreat to his cruiser, but Atlas moved to block his path. The Belgian Malinois' stance carried the same lethal precision he'd shown in 100 combat operations across 3 continents. "Deputy Chief Roberts," Carter continued, "we've been watching you. The bribes, the threats, the coordination with Serpientes Negras, but we needed to catch you in action. Thanks for making it easy." Sarah kept her hand steady on Zeus's harness as more federal vehicles arrived. She watched. Ramirez's face as understanding dawned. He hadn't been attacking a vulnerable farmer. He'd walked into a trap set by someone who'd spent her career preparing dogs for exactly this type of situation. "The Vasquez family," Sarah's voice was cold, "and all the others you threatened. They're safe now, relocated while you were focused on trying to intimidate me. You have no idea what you're interrupting," Ramirez snarled. "This is bigger than you know. We have connections." "In law enforcement?" Carter cut him off. "Like Roberts here? We know. That's why we needed someone outside the system. Someone with unique capabilities that you wouldn't recognize until it was too late." Through the vineyard rows, Maria watched in amazement as Sarah's farm dogs maintained a perfect perimeter, their military training evident in every movement. "All this time," she whispered, "I thought you were just good with animals." Sarah kept her focus on the scene unfolding before her, but she allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes, the best weapon wasn't what people could see, it was what they failed to recognize until it was too late. The morning sun climbed higher over Sierra Vista as federal agents began processing the scene. But this was just the beginning. Sarah knew from experience that operations like this were never simple. Ramirez's words about connections worried her, and the look in Carter's eyes suggested there was much more to come. Zeus pressed against her leg, his combat-ready tension not yet fully released. Sarah scratched his ears, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and concern. They'd won this round, but her tactical instincts told her the real battle was just beginning. The cartel wouldn't take this defeat lightly, and corrupt officials like Roberts rarely operated alone. The morning was about to become very interesting indeed. Carter secured Ramirez and Roberts in separate vehicles while her team processed the scene. Sarah stood by the farmhouse porch, Zeus at her side, watching federal agents photograph evidence and collect weapons. Through years of combat training, she'd learned to read situations beyond their surface, and something about this didn't feel complete. Your instincts were right, Carter approached, her voice low. This is bigger than Serpientes Negras trying to grab border farms. Those weapons we found in their vehicles, military grade, with serial numbers that trace back to restricted government shipments. Sarah felt Zeus shift slightly, responding to changes in her posture. Atlas and Artemis maintained their patrol pattern around the property, their training, allowing them to secure the perimeter while appearing to simply guard the farm. The corruption goes higher than Roberts, doesn't it? Much higher. We've traced similar land grabs across 3 states, always the same pattern: farms near the border, corrupt local officials, cartel pressure. But it's not just about smuggling routes. Carter handed Sarah a folder. They're building something. Sarah opened the file, her tactical mind processing the surveillance photos. Construction equipment being delivered to seized properties, specialized machinery, unusual security patterns. These aren't just staging areas, she realized. They're creating infrastructure. Exactly. But for what? Carter watched as more federal vehicles arrived. That's what we need to find out, and why we need your help, Sarah. You and your team. Zeus's ears perked up at approaching vehicles, not federal this time. Sarah recognized the sound of Maria's son's motorcycle before it appeared. Pedro skidded to a stop in the gravel, his young face tight with urgency. Miss Sarah, they're at the Vasquez farm. Men in suits, but they're not federal agents. They're removing everything from the barn, all the equipment Mr. Ramirez had delivered. They've got trucks, professional crews, their cleaning house, Sarah finished. How many men? At least 20. They're working fast, like they know time is running out. Pedro's eyes darted to the federal agents. Should I tell? No, Carter cut in sharply. If we move officially, we'll spook them. This is our chance to see where they take everything, track it back to... A sharp bark from Atlas interrupted her. Sarah read her dog's signal instantly. New vehicles approaching, still out of human earshot. Artemis moved to a better observation position while Zeus remained steady at Sarah's side. Maria, Sarah called to her friend on the porch, get inside, take Pedro with you. Carter, your people need to look busy with the arrests. Nothing that suggests we've noticed anything new. You're not thinking of... Carter began, but Sarah's expression stopped her. She'd seen that look before, during their years working together on military operations. At least let me send backup. They'll spot a tail, and your agents stand out too much in this area. Sarah checked her watch. But there's another way to track them. Zeus, prep. The Belgian Malinois shifted stance instantly, combat-ready but appearing relaxed. Atlas, Artemis, Shadow. The 2 dogs melted into the vineyard with practiced efficiency, becoming virtually invisible among the vines. Carter remembered watching them perfect that technique during counter-terrorism training. The ability to move undetected while maintaining perfect tactical awareness. 3 black SUVs appeared on the main road, moving with the purposeful speed of people who didn't want to attract attention but needed to work quickly. They slowed briefly, assessing the federal presence at Sarah's farm before continuing toward the Vasquez property. Senior cartel members, Sarah noted, reading their movement patterns, probably direct links to whoever's really running this operation. They'll coordinate the cleanup, make sure nothing traceable gets left behind. Sarah, Carter's voice carried warning, if they're that high level, they'll have serious security. Even with your dogs, they're expecting federal agents. Sarah replied calmly, looking for obvious tails, monitoring radio traffic, watching for surveillance teams. They're not looking for 3 dogs and a farmer. She smiled slightly. Sometimes the best way to track someone is to use the skills they don't think to defend against. Through the vineyard, Atlas and Artemis had already begun moving toward the Vasquez farm, using terrain and foliage for cover, just as they'd done in combat zones across the world. Zeus waited for Sarah's signal, his posture relaxed, but his muscles coiled for action. "Give me 4 hours," Sarah told Carter. "Keep the federal presence visible here. Make them think you're focused on processing." Ramirez and Roberts, by the time they realize what's really happening, they'll have led us straight to whatever they're trying to hide, Carter finished. She'd seen Sarah and her dogs pull off similar operations before, tracking high-value targets through terrain that would have stopped conventional forces. Maria emerged from the farmhouse, her face tight with concern. "Sarah, Pedro says there are more vehicles gathering at the old Thompson ranch, the one that sold last month. They're moving equipment there too." Sarah's tactical mind processed the information. They're not just cleaning one site, they're clearing everything, probably moving to a backup location. She turned to Carter. "Your federal presence spooked them more than we thought. They're abandoning the whole operation." "Which means we've got one shot at this," Carter agreed. "Miss whatever they're moving now, and we might never uncover what they're really building out here." Zeus shifted slightly, detecting something new. Sarah read her dog's signal and nodded toward the highway. "More vehicles coming. Heavy trucks this time. They're moving serious equipment." "Sarah," Maria's voice carried years of friendship and concern. "These aren't just cartel thugs anymore. If they're moving this fast, bringing in this much manpower, they're protecting something bigger than we thought," Sarah finished. She felt the familiar pre-mission focus settling over her, memories of countless operations flowing through her mind. "Carter, keep your people visible but contained. Whatever we find, we'll need official deniability until we can prove where it leads." Zeus's muscles tensed beneath her hand, combat ready but maintaining his farm dog appearance. Through the vineyard, Sarah knew Atlas and Artemis were already in position, using their training to remain undetected while establishing the perfect tracking pattern. 4 hours, she repeated to Carter. "If we're not back by then, you'll find everything you need on my laptop. The password is Kandahar 2014. Carter nodded grimly, understanding the reference to their last operation together. "Just remember, we need proof that leads all the way to the top. Whatever they're building out here, whoever's really behind it, we get one shot at exposing all of it." Sarah watched the dust clouds rising from the Vasquez farm, signs of major equipment being moved. Her tactical mind was already plotting approaches, calculating patterns, preparing for what would likely be her team's most important mission since leaving active duty. "Zeus! Shadow!" she commanded quietly. The Belgian Malinois moved with liquid grace, shifting from alert farm dog to combat operator in an instant. Together, they began moving through the vineyard, following the path Atlas and Artemis had already secured. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs prepared to uncover exactly what the cartels were building along the border and why they were willing to risk so much to protect it. The real operation was about to begin. Through the sun-baked terrain between properties, Sarah and her dogs moved with practiced efficiency. Years of combat operations had taught them how to use the landscape itself as cover, making their movement nearly invisible to casual observation. Zeus stayed close, while Atlas and Artemis maintained a wider perimeter, their training allowing them to track multiple threats while remaining undetected. The activity at the Vasquez farm had intensified. From her concealed position behind a ridge, Sarah counted 4 heavy trucks and at least 6 SUVs. Men in expensive suits directed workers with military precision, supervising the rapid dismantling and removal of equipment. 15 men on the ground, she whispered to Zeus, whose ears perked at her voice. 4 on perimeter security, all with combat training based on their movement patterns. The Belgian Malinois' muscles tensed slightly, processing the tactical situation just as he'd been trained to do. Atlas appeared silently at her side, giving a specific alert signal. Sarah read her dog's behavior and nodded. He detected something in the equipment being loaded. Years of counter-narcotics operations had taught her dogs to recognize the chemical signatures of drug production, but this was different. Not just drugs, she murmured, watching another piece of machinery being carefully loaded. That's pharmaceutical-grade equipment, clean room components. Her tactical mind raced. Through implications, they're not setting up normal cartel operations. This is something else. A low whistle caught her attention. Maria's son Pedro, approaching with the stealth of a local who knew every inch of this terrain. He crouched beside her, careful to stay hidden. "Miss Sarah," he whispered, "more trucks just arrived at the Thompson Ranch. But there's something else. My cousin works at the medical supply warehouse in town. Says they had a huge delivery last week. Specialized equipment, stuff they've never handled before. All went to these properties that the cartel bought." Sarah felt Zeus shift slightly, detecting new movement. Through her tactical scope, she watched men in laboratory clothing emerging from the Vasquez barn, carefully supervising the loading of sealed containers. Those aren't cartel soldiers, she realized. They're scientists, professional ones, based on how they're handling that equipment. She focused on one man in particular, noting how the others deferred to him. "That's their chief researcher. Whatever they're building out here, it's sophisticated enough to need serious expertise." Artemis appeared next, giving Sarah another signal. The dog had completed her reconnaissance of the Thompson Ranch. Sarah read her behavior patterns, developed through hundreds of combat missions. "They're splitting the operation," she translated, "moving half the equipment north, half south. Smart. Harder to track, and if we intercept one convoy, they still have backups." She touched her radio, concealed as a simple phone earpiece. "Carter, you getting this?" Every word. The federal agent's voice came back. "We've identified." 2 of the scientists through facial recognition. Both worked for major pharmaceutical companies until last year, when they supposedly retired. Their expertise is in synthetic protein development. Pedro's eyes widened. "Like vaccines or biological weapons?" Sarah replied grimly. Zeus tensed beneath her hand, picking up on her concern. "The cartels are evolving. This isn't just about drugs anymore. They're trying to develop something new." Through her scope, she watched the chief scientist carefully supervise the loading of a specific container, one that required special handling. The man's movements, his obvious concern for the contents, told her volumes. They've already started production, she realized. This isn't just setup. They've been manufacturing whatever it is for weeks. The land grabs, the corrupt officials. It was all to protect something that's already operational. Artemis suddenly went rigid, giving an urgent alert. Seconds later, Sarah heard what her dog had detected. Helicopters approaching. Not news. Helicopters or law enforcement based on the sound signature. These were military grade. Private security, she murmured, recognizing the flight patterns. Professional teams coming to secure the convoy routes. She turned to Pedro. Get back to the farm. Tell Carter they're bringing in heavy support. This just got a lot more complicated. As the boy slipped away, Sarah processed the tactical situation. The cartel wasn't just protecting an operation. They were treating this like a high-priority military extraction. Whatever they were producing in these makeshift labs was valuable enough to warrant serious security investment. Zeus gave another alert as more vehicles arrived. These were different. Unmarked SUVs with government plates, carrying men in suits who moved with the distinctive bearing of federal agents. But something was wrong about their pattern. They're not here to stop anything, Sarah realized, watching them coordinate with the cartel security teams. They're helping with the evacuation. Carter, are you seeing this? Got it. Carter's voice was tight. Those aren't just any federal agents. That's Section Chief Anderson's personal security team. This goes higher than we thought. Sarah watched the interaction through her scope, her tactical mind processing implications. The corruption isn't just local law enforcement. They've got protection at federal level. That's why they were so confident about setting up here. Atlas and Artemis moved to new positions as the security perimeter expanded. Sarah noted how the dogs naturally adapted their concealment techniques, using years of combat experience to remain undetected while maintaining perfect observation positions. Through her earpiece, she heard Carter cursing softly. Sarah, we've got a problem. Orders just came down from Washington. We're being told to stand down, classify everything related to this operation as national security. They're trying to bury it, Sarah replied, watching more equipment being loaded. Whatever they're producing here, someone in government wants it to continue. She focused on the chief scientist again, noting how he personally supervised the loading of certain containers. But they made one mistake. What's that? They think they're just dealing with federal agents. People who have to follow orders, work within the system. Sarah smiled slightly as her dogs maintained their perfect observation positions, gathering intelligence that would have been impossible for human operators to collect. They don't know about us. Zeus shifted slightly, detecting new movement patterns. Sarah read her dog's signal and adjusted her focus. The evacuation was accelerating, but it wasn't chaos. This was a carefully planned contingency. Probably rehearsed multiple times. Carter, I need you to maintain your visible presence at my farm. Keep them thinking you're focused on processing Ramirez and Roberts. Meanwhile, she checked her tactical gear, concealed beneath casual farm clothing. We're going to track both convoys. These dogs didn't complete hundreds of combat missions by letting targets escape. Through her scope, she watched Section Chief Anderson himself arrive, coordinating with the cartel's security teams. The man's presence confirmed her suspicions. This operation had protection at the highest levels. 4 hours, she reminded. Carter, By then, we'll know exactly what they're producing, who's protecting it, and why they're willing to risk so much to keep it hidden. Zeus pressed against her leg, combat ready but maintaining perfect stillness. Through the desert terrain, Atlas and Artemis were already moving to track the first vehicles leaving the Vasquez farm. Years of military operations had taught them all that sometimes the best way to uncover the truth was to let the enemy think they'd escaped. The morning heat shimmered across the desert as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs prepared to expose a conspiracy that reached from Mexican cartels into the highest levels of American government. The real mission was just beginning. Sarah tracked both convoys through her tactical scope, noting how they split along carefully planned routes. The northern group headed toward the Thompson Ranch, while the southern convoy took the old mining road that wound toward the Mexican border. Zeus remained motionless beside her, but his muscles carried combat-ready tension. "Carter," she whispered into her concealed radio. "They're moving faster than expected. The scientific team is splitting. Up to half the researchers with each convoy." "Copy that," Carter's voice came back quietly. "We've identified more players. That private security team, former Delta Force, now working for a company called Nexus Operations. They've got contracts across 3 federal agencies." Sarah watched, the chief scientist supervising the loading of the last containers, his movements betraying urgent concern. This isn't normal cartel security protocol. The way they're handling that equipment, those sealed containers, they're treating this like a classified military operation. Through her tactical scope, she noted the convoy's sophisticated security formation. 4 vehicles per convoy, staggered defense pattern. Lead and tail vehicles carrying armed teams, middle vehicles protecting the equipment and research staff. Her mind raced through options. They're not just watching for law enforcement, they're prepared for military-grade interception attempts. Atlas appeared silently at her position, giving a specific alert. Sarah read her dog's signal with practiced efficiency. "Carter, Atlas is picking up something from those containers. Not drugs, not typical chemical signatures, something new." "Sarah," Carter's voice carried warning. "Anderson's team just received orders from Washington. They're getting air support, unmarked helicopters, probably more Nexus contractors. Whatever's in those containers, someone wants it protected at all costs." Zeus shifted slightly, detecting new movement. Sarah adjusted her scope, focusing on a figure emerging from one of the SUVs. "Hold on. Carter, are you seeing this? That's Senator Morrison's chief of staff. What's he doing at a cartel evacuation? Did he?" "Gets worse," Carter replied. "We just traced some of the equipment manifests. They match requisition orders from a classified DoD project, something called Operation Chimera. But here's the thing. Officially, that project was shut down 2 years ago." Sarah's tactical mind processed the implications as she watched the convoy preparations conclude. The chief scientist made one final check of the sealed containers, then had a brief but intense conversation with the senator's aide. "They're not just producing drugs," she realized. "They're developing something else, something the government wants but can't create officially. The cartels provide deniability, corrupt officials provide protection, and someone high up gets..." She paused, watching the scientist's careful handling of the containers. "What exactly are they making out here?" Zeus suddenly went rigid, giving a combat alert. Through her scope, Sarah saw what her dog had already detected. More vehicles, approaching, these moving with tactical precision that spoke of serious military training. Carter, we've got new players. 3 unmarked vehicles moving like special forces, but they're not with Nexus or Anderson's team. She studied their approach pattern. These are different. Professional, but not American military style. Cartel. Special Forces, Carter confirmed. Former Mexican military units, top-level enforcement teams. They only show up when something's critically important to the cartel's operations. Sarah watched the new arrivals coordinate with the existing security teams, noting their practiced efficiency. The cartels aren't just providing cover for someone else's operation. They're full partners in whatever's being developed. Atlas and Artemis had already moved to shadow the convoys, their training allowing them to track vehicles while remaining completely undetected. Sarah noted their positions, calculating intercept options. "We need to split up," she told Carter. "The dogs can track both convoys, but we need to know what's in those containers. Whatever they're moving, it's the key to this whole operation." "Sarah," Carter's voice carried genuine concern, "these aren't street thugs. Between Nexus, Anderson's team, and the cartel's special forces, they've got enough firepower to start a small war. That's why they won't expect anyone to try tracking them," Sarah replied, checking her tactical gear. "Zeus, prep." The Belgian Malinois shifted stance instantly, combat ready, but appearing relaxed. Atlas, Artemis, Shadow Pattern Delta. The 2 dogs acknowledged their commands with subtle movements, their years of combat experience evident in every motion. Sarah had spent over a decade developing these techniques, teaching dogs to operate in environments where traditional military forces would be detected instantly. "Carter, maintain your visible presence at the farm. Let them think we're focused on Ramirez and Roberts." Sarah watched the convoys begin to move, their formations perfect but predictable. "Meanwhile, we'll show them why some enemies are harder to spot than others." Through her scope, she noted final preparations as the convoys prepared to depart. The chief scientist made one last check of his precious cargo, while the senator's aide spoke urgently into a secure phone. The cartel's special forces took up escort positions, their movements betraying years of military training. 4 hours, Sarah reminded Carter. By then, we'll know exactly what they're producing, who's protecting it, and why they're willing to risk exposing such high-level connections to keep it hidden. Zeus pressed against her leg, his muscles coiled with combat-ready tension. Through the desert terrain, Atlas and Artemis were already moving to their tracking positions, using techniques perfected in hundreds of military operations. "Sarah," Carter's voice came through one final time, "if you're right about Operation Chimera, about what they're developing, be careful. Some secrets are kept hidden because exposing them could start something bigger than any of us are ready for." The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the desert as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs prepared to uncover a conspiracy that reached from Mexican cartels into the highest levels of American government. The real operation was about to begin, and some very powerful people were about to learn why certain veterans, human and canine, are more dangerous than they appear. The northern convoy moved with military precision along the desert roads, their formation perfect but predictable. Sarah and Zeus tracked them from the ridgeline, while Atlas shadowed the vehicles from a safe distance. Through her tactical scope, she noted how the security teams maintained constant communication, their movements suggesting extensive combat experience. "Carter," she whispered into her radio, "the northern group is heading towards something bigger than the Thompson Ranch. Their route suggests they're moving to a facility further north, probably in the mountains. Confirmed, Carter's voice came back. Satellite imagery shows unusual activity in the Ghost Mountain mining complex, officially abandoned 10 years ago, but there's been heavy equipment movement in the last month. Sarah watched a helicopter pass overhead, unmarked, but its flight pattern matched Nexus operations protocols. Zeus remained perfectly still beside her, but his muscles carried combat-ready tension. The chief scientist is with this group, she noted, focusing on the central vehicle. Along with those specific containers he was so careful about. Whatever. They're transporting. This is the primary cargo. Through her earpiece, she heard Pedro's voice, patched through by Carter. "Miss Sarah, my cousin just called." More medical supplies arrived at the warehouse. Specialized containment units, biohazard gear. They're being loaded onto trucks with military escorts. Sarah's tactical mind processed the information as she watched the convoy navigate a difficult turn. The security teams moved with practiced efficiency, but she noted something in their pattern. They're nervous, she realized. The security teams, they're not just being thorough. They're genuinely worried about losing those containers. Look at their response times, their coverage patterns. They're treating this like nuclear material transport. Atlas appeared silently beside her, giving a specific alert. Sarah read her dog's behavior instantly. He'd detected chemical signatures from the convoy that matched nothing in his extensive training. "Carter, Atlas is picking up something new. Not drugs, not typical biochemical agents. Whatever's in those containers, it's unique enough that even his advanced detection training doesn't recognize it." "Sarah," Carter's voice carried tension. "We just intercepted a partial transmission from Anderson's team to Washington. They mentioned something called Protocol Lazarus. Running it through our databases now, but it's highly classified." Zeus shifted slightly, catching new movement. Sarah adjusted her scope, focusing on activity ahead of the convoy. They've got forward teams securing the route, professional work, checking potential ambush points, clearing civilian traffic. "Makes sense," Carter replied. "That road passes near 3 small towns before reaching the mining complex. They can't risk anyone seeing what they're transporting." Sarah watched the convoy's progress, her mind working through implications. The security, the scientists, the classified protocols. "Carter, this isn't just about developing something new. They're transporting something that already exists, something they've already created. The question is what," Carter agreed, "and why they needed Cartel territory to develop it. Any legitimate research facility could have, unless it's not legitimate," Sarah cut in. "Unless they're working on something that couldn't exist officially, something that needed complete deniability." She paused, watching the chief scientist. "Check readings on a portable device, something that even black sites couldn't hide." Zeus suddenly went rigid, giving a combat alert. Through her scope, Sarah saw what her dog had already detected: local law enforcement vehicles approaching the convoy's route. "Carter, we've got police patrols ahead. Regular deputies, probably not part of the corruption network. How do you want to handle this?" "Stand by," Carter replied. Moments later, the patrol cars received calls, redirecting them to an apparent emergency across the county. "Clean," Sarah noted. "They've got dispatch compromised too. Complete control of who sees these vehicles." She watched the convoy continue north, noting how the security teams relaxed slightly after the patrols were diverted. Atlas moved to a new tracking position, using terrain features that Sarah had taught him to exploit during their years of military operations. "Carter, we need to get ahead of them. That mining complex, what's its layout? Sending it now, Carter responded. But Sarah, satellite shows they've completely renovated the interior, added power stations, water purification, new access, roads. Whatever they're doing in there, they've spent millions setting it up. Sarah studied the facility maps on her tactical display, her mind already plotting approach routes. Multiple entrances, but they'll use the main access. Their security protocol is too rigid to risk secondary routes. That gives us, she checked her watch, 2 hours until they reach the facility. Time to move. Zeus, prep for parallel tracking. We need to stay close enough to maintain surveillance, but far enough to avoid their perimeter sensors. The Belgian Malinois shifted stance instantly, ready to move. Through her scope, Sarah watched the convoy navigate another turn, noting how the security teams maintained perfect coverage even on difficult terrain. Sarah, Carter's voice carried warning. Anderson just received new orders. They're sending more Nexus teams to secure the facility. Full tactical units, heavy weapons. Whatever's in those containers, they're expecting serious attempts to intercept it. Good, Sarah replied calmly. Let them focus on defending against traditional threats. Meanwhile, she smiled slightly as Atlas disappeared into the landscape, becoming completely invisible while maintaining perfect tracking position. We'll show them why some enemies are harder to spot than others. Zeus pressed against her leg, combat ready but maintaining absolute stillness. Years of military operations had taught them both that patience was often the deadliest weapon. Carter, maintain radio silence unless emergency. We're moving to close-range tracking. Sarah checked her tactical gear one final time. Time to show them why dogs aren't just good at following trails. They're expert at hunting prey that thinks it's already escaped. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the desert as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs prepared to infiltrate a facility that shouldn't exist, pursuing cargo that officially didn't exist, protected by people who would kill to keep. Their secrets hidden. The real hunt was about to begin. The Ghost Mountain mining complex rose from the desert like an abandoned fortress, its renovated security features carefully disguised to maintain the appearance of desertion. Sarah watched through her tactical scope as the convoy approached the main entrance, their formation tightening in preparation for the transfer. Carter, she whispered into her radio, they're beginning final approach. Security teams are expanding their perimeter. These aren't just protective measures. They're implementing full containment protocols. Zeus lay motionless beside her, his muscles carrying that combat-ready tension she knew so well. Atlas had maintained perfect trailing position throughout the convoy's journey, while Artemis had radioed ahead with the southern convoy's movements through Sarah's encrypted network. The facility's been active for hours, Carter replied quietly. Thermal imaging shows significant internal movement. They've got full teams waiting to receive whatever's in those containers. Sarah watched the chief scientist check his portable readings again, his movements betraying increasing urgency. Something's not right, she noted. The way they're handling those containers. It's not just about security anymore. They're racing against time. Through her tactical scope, she observed new details about the facility's defenses. Multiple security layers, motion sensors, infrared, scanning. They've turned an abandoned mine into a military-grade research facility. But look at the power consumption. They're running something massive inside. Zeus suddenly shifted, giving a specific alert. Sarah read her dog's signal instantly. Carter, Zeus is picking up new chemical signatures. Whatever's in those containers, it's becoming unstable. That's why they're rushing. They're not just moving cargo, they're racing against degradation. Sarah, Carter's voice carried urgent. News, we just decoded more of that transmission about Protocol Lazarus. It's not just a security designation. It's about the cargo itself. Something about genetic reactivation and cellular restoration. The convoy reached the facility's main gate, passing through multiple security checkpoints with practiced efficiency. Sarah noted how the Nexus teams coordinated with the Cartel's special forces, their movements suggesting extensive joint training. They're not just working together, she realized. This is a long-term partnership. The cartels aren't just providing territory, they're full participants in whatever's being developed here. Atlas appeared silently at her position, giving another alert. Sarah's tactical mind processed her dog's signal patterns, developed through hundreds of combat missions. The southern convoys reached their facility too. Artemis confirms similar. Security protocols, same urgent handling of the containers. 2 facilities, identical setups, Carter mused. They're not just moving their operation, they're splitting it. Redundancy in case one site is compromised. Sarah watched the chief scientist supervise the careful unloading of his precious cargo. Through her scope, she could see the containment units more clearly now. Sophisticated equipment that seemed to combine medical technology with military-grade security measures. Those aren't just storage containers, she noted. They're active containment units with their own power supplies and monitoring systems. Whatever's inside needs constant maintenance, specific conditions to remain stable. Zeus suddenly went rigid, giving a combat alert. Seconds later, Sarah heard what her dog had already detected. More helicopters approaching, these moving with different flight patterns than the Nexus teams. Carter, we've got new players incoming. 3 helicopters, military grade but unmarked. These aren't Nexus or Cartel forces. Different approach protocol, different equipment profile. Confirmed, Carter replied tensely. These are... Sarah, these are CDC birds. We just intercepted their flight clearance. Whatever's happening in that facility, it's got the Centers for Disease Control involved now. Sarah's tactical mind raced through implications as she watched the new arrivals land. Medical teams emerged, wearing specialized protective gear that went beyond standard biohazard protocols. This isn't just about drugs or weapons, she realized. They're developing something biological, something that needs containment protocols we've never seen before. She focused on the chief scientist again, noting how he directed the medical teams with urgent authority. Something that's drawing attention from every agency that deals with potential epidemics. Through her earpiece, she heard Pedro's voice again. Miss Sarah, more news from town. They're setting up quarantine equipment at the medical warehouse. But it's strange. They're not preparing for containment. They're setting up revival protocols. Like they're expecting to treat people who are already... Already what? Carter asked. Dead. Sarah finished grimly, watching the careful choreography of container transfer below. Protocol Lazarus. It's not just a code name. They're actually trying to... She paused, her mind struggling with the implications. Carter, what exactly was Operation Chimera researching before it was officially shut down? Give me a minute, Carter replied. Sarah could hear her accessing encrypted databases. Here, Operation Chimera was a classified DoD project studying rapid tissue regeneration, trying to develop ways to treat catastrophic combat injuries. But they shut it down after... Oh my God. What? They shut it down after their test subjects started showing signs of cellular reactivation post-mortem. They weren't just healing wounds, they were reversing death itself. But the subjects became unstable, aggressive. The project was terminated and all research was ordered destroyed. Sarah watched the facility's activity with new understanding. Except it wasn't destroyed. Someone moved it here, outside official channels, used cartel territory and corrupt officials to continue the research in secret. Zeus shifted slightly, detecting new movement patterns. Sarah adjusted her scope, focusing on the secure vehicle that had just arrived. Carter, are you seeing this? That's not just any CDC official. That's Dr. James Morrison, the original lead researcher from Operation Chimera. The senator's brother, Carter added. The connection's complete now. Political protection, cartel infrastructure, private security. They've built everything they need to continue the research without oversight. Atlas moved to a new position as the facility's security patterns shifted. Sarah noted how her dogs naturally adapted their surveillance techniques, using years of combat experience to remain undetected while gathering crucial intelligence. Sarah, Carter's voice carried deadly seriousness, if they've actually succeeded, if they've found a way to reverse death itself, then we're not just dealing with corruption or illegal research, Sarah finished. We're dealing with something that could change everything, something people would kill to control. She watched Dr. Morrison greet his former colleague, their urgent conversation suggesting both excitement and concern. We need to get inside that facility, she decided. See exactly what they're developing, what they're willing to risk everything to protect. She checked her tactical gear, while Zeus remained combat-ready beside her. Carter, maintain surveillance of the southern site. Monitor Artemis's signals for any changes in their operation. Through her scope, she watched the facility's external activity begin to slow as the cargo was moved inside. Security teams maintained their perimeter, but their patterns were shifting, focusing inward now, protecting something they'd already secured. 4 hours, Sarah reminded herself quietly, feeling Zeus press against her leg with combat-ready tension. Time to show them why some secrets can't stay buried and why some hunters are more dangerous than they appear. The desert sun cast harsh shadows across Ghost Mountain as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs prepared to infiltrate a facility where death itself was being challenged. The real mission and its world-changing implications was about to begin. The Ghost Mountain facility's security perimeter looked impenetrable, but Sarah had spent years teaching dogs to exploit weaknesses that most people never noticed. She studied the patrol patterns through her tactical scope, noting how the Nexus teams coordinated with cartel forces. Carter, she whispered, the security looks solid, but they've made one critical mistake. Their sensors are calibrated for human intruders, thermal signatures, movement patterns, weight triggers. They're not looking for canine infiltration. Teams! Zeus remained motionless beside her, but his muscles carried that familiar pre-mission tension. Through her earpiece, she heard Carter accessing satellite data. The mine's original ventilation system, Carter reported. Most of it's been sealed off, but thermal imaging shows some shafts are still active. They'd need them for air circulation, especially with biological research. Sarah watched a CDC team enter the facility, their protective gear suggesting serious biohazard protocols. That's our way in. The old ventilation shafts would be too small for human infiltration, but perfect for dogs trained in confined space operations. Atlas appeared silently at her position, giving a specific alert. Sarah, read her dog's signal patterns instantly. The containers have all been moved inside, but Atlas is picking up stronger chemical signatures now. Whatever they're working with, it's becoming more unstable. Through her tactical scope, she observed Dr. Morrison speaking urgently with security. Teams, his gestures suggesting growing concern. They're accelerating their timeline. Something's forcing them to move faster than planned. Sarah, Carter's voice carried new tension. We just intercepted more communications about Protocol Lazarus. They're not just continuing the old research, they've achieved something new, something that's making even their own scientists nervous. Zeus suddenly shifted, detecting movement below. Sarah adjusted her focus, watching a new team arrive. These wearing specialized containment suits, unlike anything she'd seen before. Those aren't CDC protocols, she noted. That's military-grade biological containment gear, the kind used for handling weapons-grade pathogens. She paused, processing implications. They're not just trying to reverse death. They're weaponizing. The process? Miss Sarah, Pedro's voice came through, patched in by Carter. More news from town. The medical warehouse. They're setting up some kind of containment cells. Heavy security, specialized equipment. Like they're preparing to handle dangerous patients. Sarah's tactical mind raced through scenarios as she watched the facility's activities. They've succeeded in reactivating dead tissue, but they can't control the results. The subjects become aggressive, unstable, just like in the original project. But why continue? Carter asked. If they know the subjects become dangerous, because that's exactly what they want, Sarah realized, watching. Dr. Morrison supervised the arrival of more containment equipment. Think about it. Soldiers who can survive lethal injuries, who can keep fighting even after what should be fatal wounds. The perfect warrior, if you can control them. Atlas moved to a new position as the security patterns shifted. Sarah noted how her dogs naturally adapted their surveillance, using techniques perfected in countless combat operations. Carter, what's the status on the southern facility? Artemis reports similar activities. They're fully operational, running parallel research. If we shut down one site, they continue at the other, Sarah finished. Classic redundancy. But it also means they're vulnerable. They have to maintain constant communication between sites. Coordinate their research. Zeus gave another alert as more helicopters approached. Sarah tracked them through her scope, noting their flight patterns. More CDC teams arriving. They're bringing something. Carter, can you access their flight? Manifest? Working on it, Carter replied. Moments later, listed as biological samples, but the containment protocols. Sarah, these are active test subjects. They're bringing in more specimens for their experiments. Sarah watched the careful unloading process, noting how even the heavily armed security teams kept their distance from the containment units. They're not just researching anymore, they're scaling up, preparing for something bigger. Through her tactical scope, she could see Dr. Morrison checking readings on specialized equipment, his expression betraying both excitement and concern. The original Operation Chimera was purely medical, trying to save soldiers' lives. But they're creating something else, something they can't fully control. Zeus shifted slightly, detecting new movement patterns. Sarah adjusted her focus, watching teams of technicians preparing what looked like stasis chambers inside the facility's entrance. Those aren't just for storage, she noted. They're transport pods, designed for long-term containment. They're getting ready to move something. She paused, processing implications. or someone. Sarah, Carter's voice carried urgent news. We just decoded more transmissions. They're not just expecting the subjects to be aggressive, they're counting on it. These containment protocols, the security measures, they're designed to handle combat-capable specimens. Sarah watched another CDC team enter the facility, their protective gear more extensive than the previous groups. They're playing with something they don't fully understand, thinking they can control it through pure force. Like the cartels, Carter added, using violence to maintain order, never realizing that violence only breeds more violence. Atlas appeared again, giving a specific alert. Sarah read her dog's behavior and nodded grimly. The ventilation shaft. Entrances are minimally guarded. They think they're too small for infiltration, too well monitored for human access. But not for dogs trained in confined space combat operations, Carter finished. Sarah, if you're really going in there, we need to see exactly what they're developing, Sarah replied, checking her tactical gear while Zeus remained combat ready. Beside her, document everything. Find out who's really behind this project and what they're planning to do with these specimens they're creating. Through her scope, she watched the facility's external activity settle into regular patterns. Security teams maintained their perimeter, but their focus was shifting inward, protecting whatever was happening in those reinforced laboratories. Carter maintained surveillance of both sites. If anything changes, if they start moving specimens or equipment. She paused, watching Dr. Morrison enter the facility with another team of researchers. We'll need to move fast. Zeus pressed against her leg, his muscles carrying that perfect combination of tension and control that came from hundreds of combat missions. Atlas had already moved to secure their approach route, using techniques that made him virtually invisible to conventional security. Remember, Sarah whispered to her dogs, feeling the familiar pre-mission focus settling over her team. We're not just fighting cartel forces or corrupt officials anymore. We're dealing with something that could change. Warfare forever, if we don't stop it first. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ghost Mountain as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs prepared to infiltrate a facility where the boundaries between life and death were being deliberately erased. The real mission and its terrifying implications was about to begin. The ventilation shaft entrance was exactly as Sarah's tactical analysis had predicted, minimally guarded, deemed too small for human infiltration. She watched the security patrols through her scope, noting their predictable patterns. Carter, she whispered, we've got a 10-second window between perimeter sweeps. The dogs can move through the shaft system while the guards are focused on their standard patrol routes. Zeus remained perfectly still beside her, but his muscles carried that combat-ready tension she knew so well. Through her earpiece, she heard Carter accessing the facility's blueprints. The main ventilation system branches into 3 primary shafts, Carter reported. Based on thermal imaging, the research labs are located in the eastern section. But Sarah, we're picking up strange readings from those areas. Temperature, fluctuations that don't match any known scientific processes. Sarah watched another CDC team enter the facility, their protective gear even more elaborate than the previous groups. They're escalating containment protocols. Whatever they're working with is becoming more unstable, more dangerous. Atlas appeared silently at her position, giving a specific alert. She read her dog's signal patterns instantly. The chemical signatures are stronger now. Atlas is detecting compounds he's never encountered before, even with all his counter-bio-weapon training. Through her tactical scope, she observed Dr. Morrison emerge briefly, speaking urgently with a security team. His protective suit was spattered with something dark, and his movements betrayed barely controlled panic. They're losing control, she realized. Whatever they've created, it's not behaving as predicted. She paused, processing implications. Carter, check those thermal readings again. Focus on patterns, not just temperatures. Running analysis now, Carter replied. A moment later, oh God, Sarah, those fluctuations, they're moving. Like heat signatures from living subjects, but the patterns are all wrong. Too erratic, too intense. Zeus suddenly shifted, detecting movement below. Sarah adjusted her focus. Watching a new team rush into the facility, medical personnel carrying emergency response equipment. Carter, we need to move now. Something's happening in there, something they can't contain. She checked her tactical gear one final time. Zeus, Atlas, infiltration pattern Delta. The dogs moved with liquid grace, their years of combat training, evident in every motion. Sarah had spent countless hours developing these techniques, teaching them to operate in environments that would stop conventional military forces. The shaft entrance is ahead, she whispered to her team. Remember your confined space protocols. If you detect any biological threats, any unusual specimens, maintain distance and alert. Through her earpiece, she heard Pedro's urgent voice. Miss Sarah, more news from town. They're evacuating the medical warehouse, destroying records. Something's spooked them badly. Sarah watched her dogs approach the ventilation shaft, their movements precisely coordinated. Carter, status on the southern facility? Artemis reports increased activity, Carter replied. They're implementing emergency protocols there too. Whatever's happening, it's affecting both sites. The first patrol passed their position. The guards focused outward, never suspecting that the real threat would come from an entrance they deemed too small for concern. Sarah gave the signal, and her dogs moved. Zeus and Atlas slipped into the shaft with practiced efficiency, their training, allowing them to move silently through spaces that would trap human operators. Sarah followed, her own movements calculated to minimize any sound or vibration that might trigger sensors. The shaft's interior was tight but navigable, its metal walls carrying the facility's sounds in strange ways. Sarah could hear machinery, urgent voices, and something else, sounds that made no biological sense. Carter, she whispered, we're in. The main shaft splits ahead. Based on the airflow, which branch leads to the research labs? Eastern Fork, Carter replied. But Sarah, those thermal signatures are getting stronger. Whatever's causing them, it's becoming more active. Zeus suddenly froze, giving a combat alert she hadn't seen since their worst operations overseas. Through the shaft's metal walls, Sarah heard what had triggered her dog's warning, screams, but not normal ones. These sounds carried something else, something that spoke of neither life nor death, but something horrifyingly in between. They've lost containment, she realized, hearing the facility's alarm systems activate. Their specimens, whatever they've created, they're loose. Atlas moved closer, giving another alert. Sarah read her dog's signal and felt her blood run cold. Carter, Atlas is picking up multiple biological signatures, all wrong, like dead tissue that's somehow still metabolically active. Through the shaft system, she could hear chaos erupting in the facility. Security teams shouting orders, medical personnel screaming for emergency protocols, and those other sounds, those impossible sounds of things that should not exist. Sarah, Carter's voice carried deadly urgency. Dr. Morrison just sent an emergency transmission to Washington. They're requesting immediate containment response. Military-grade weapons, full biochemical warfare units. Whatever they've created in there has become exactly what they wanted, Sarah finished grimly. The perfect weapon. Soldiers that can't be killed because they're already dead. But they can't control them anymore. Zeus pressed against her in the confined space, his muscles, carrying that perfect tension between combat readiness and disciplined restraint. Through the shaft system, Atlas had already begun moving toward the research labs, using his training to track multiple threats while remaining undetected. Carter maintains surveillance of both facilities. If anything breaches containment, if any of these specimens escape into the general population. She paused, hearing more of those horrifying sounds echoing through the facility. The infection could spread beyond anything they predicted. Through her tactical gear, she could feel the facility's vibrations changing as emergency protocols activated. Security teams were sealing sections, trying to contain whatever horrors their research had unleashed. Remember, she whispered to her dogs, feeling that familiar focus that came with the most dangerous missions. We're not just fighting to expose their operation anymore. We're fighting to prevent something that could destroy everything. The facility's emergency lights cast strange shadows through the ventilation system as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs moved deeper into a nightmare of mankind's own creation. The real horror and the fight to contain it was about to begin. The ventilation shaft system opened into a maintenance access point, giving Sarah her first clear view of the facility's interior. Emergency lights cast pulsing red shadows across corridors that had been pristine minutes ago, but now showed signs of violent struggle. "Carter," she whispered, "we've got access to sub-level 3. Multiple security breaches visible. Whatever they were containing, it's loose now." Zeus and Atlas moved with combat precision, their training allowing them to process the chaotic environment while maintaining perfect tactical awareness. Through her earpiece, she heard Carter coordinating with federal response teams. "Sarah, CDC Command just issued a Level 5 containment alert. They're preparing to seal the entire mountain. But there's something else. They're not just concerned about infection. The orders mention active hostile entities." Sarah watched. A group of security personnel rushed past their position, their weapons raised but their movements betraying barely controlled panic. Behind them, she could hear those impossible sounds, neither human nor animal, neither living nor dead. The specimens aren't just loose, she realized, observing bloody marks on the walls that defied normal injury patterns. They're hunting, whatever process they used, to reactivate dead tissue. It's created something with pure predatory instincts. Atlas suddenly gave a specific alert, one she hadn't seen since their worst counter-bioweapon operations. Through the corridor, she could see what had triggered her dog's warning. A security team member, but wrong somehow. His movements were jerky, aggressive, and his skin carried a grey pallor that spoke of death, yet he was clearly impossibly mobile. "Carter!" Sarah's voice carried controlled tension. "We've got confirmation. The reanimation process works, but the subjects become hostile immediately. They're not just aggressive. They're actively predatory, and the infection spreads through contact." Through the facility's speaker system, she could hear Dr. Morrison's voice calling for emergency protocols. but his words were nearly drowned out by sounds of fighting and those otherworldly screams. "Sarah," Carter reported urgently, "Artemis just signaled from the southern facility. They're experiencing containment breaches too. The specimens are displaying coordinated behavior, like they're operating on some kind of shared instinct." Zeus shifted slightly, detecting new movement patterns. Sarah adjusted her position, watching a team of researchers flee down an adjacent corridor. Behind them, something moved in ways that violated natural law. They thought they could control it, she muttered, observing how the infected subjects coordinated their hunting patterns. They thought they were creating the perfect weapon, soldiers who couldn't die. Instead, they've created predators with military training and no human limitations. Through her tactical gear, she could feel the facility's vibrations changing. As heavy security doors slammed into place, the containment protocols were creating a maze of sealed sections, trapping both survivors and infected in a deadly game of hide and seek. "Carter, what's the status on military response?" 20 minutes out, Carter replied. "But Sarah, their orders. They're not coming to rescue survivors. They're coming to sanitize the entire facility, both facilities. They'll bury this so deep, no one will ever know what really happened." Sarah watched another security team engage an infected subject, their weapons seemingly ineffective against something that was already dead. The creature moved with horrible efficiency, its military training still evident in its hunting patterns. These aren't just random test subjects, she realized. They were using military personnel, probably deceased special forces operators. The perfect combination, elite training with no human limitations. Atlas gave another alert as more infected subjects appeared, their movements suggesting tactical coordination that should have been impossible for mindless creatures. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she recognized their formation patterns. "They're maintaining their combat training," she reported to Carter. "These things aren't just aggressive. They're displaying coordinated small unit tactics. They're hunting in teams, using their military experience even after death." Through the facility's chaos, she could hear Dr. Morrison's increasingly desperate orders, trying to maintain some control over a situation that had spiraled far beyond any containment protocols. "Sarah," Carter's voice carried deadly urgency, "we just intercepted more transmissions. The infection rate is accelerating. Anyone killed by these things becomes like them within minutes. The entire facility could be overrun before the military arrives." Zeus pressed against her leg, his muscles carrying that perfect tension between combat readiness and disciplined control. Through the corridor system, Atlas had already begun tracking multiple threats, using his training to predict the infected subjects' movement patterns. "We need to reach the central lab," Sarah decided, checking her tactical gear. "Find out exactly what process they used, what weaknesses these things might have. There has to be a way to stop them before they breach the facility's outer containment." Through her earpiece, she heard Pedro's voice again. "Miss Sarah, something's happening in town. People are acting strange, becoming violent. The infection, it's already spreading somehow." Sarah's tactical mind raced through implications as she watched another group of infected subjects coordinate their hunting patterns. They didn't just lose containment here. They've been testing subjects in town, probably using the medical warehouse as a secret research site. "Sarah," Carter's voice carried grim determination, "if these things reach populated areas, if the infection spreads beyond containment, then we're looking at something worse than any weapon they could have imagined," Sarah finished. "We're looking at the end of everything." Zeus and Atlas moved with practiced precision as they navigated the facility's chaos. Their years of combat experience allowing them to track multiple threats while avoiding detection. Sarah had trained them for the worst combat scenarios imaginable, but nothing had prepared them for hunting prey that was neither fully dead nor truly alive. "Remember," she whispered to her dogs, feeling that familiar focus that came with the most dangerous missions. "We're not just fighting to expose their operation anymore, we're fighting to save everything." The facility's emergency lights cast writhing shadows across blood-stained corridors as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs moved deeper into a nightmare of humanity's own creation. The real battle against an enemy that death itself couldn't stop was about to begin. The central laboratory complex loomed before them, its reinforced doors bearing marks of desperate violence. Sarah watched through her tactical scope as infected subjects prowled the corridors, their movements displaying terrifying combination of military precision and predatory instinct. "Carter," she whispered, "we've reached the main research center. Security systems are compromised, but the blast doors are still holding. Multiple infected inside, showing coordinated hunting patterns." Zeus and Atlas maintained perfect tactical positions, their combat training allowing them to track the infected subjects while remaining undetected. Through the facility's emergency lighting, Sarah could see evidence of the horror that had unfolded. Scattered research equipment, blood-stained containment suits, and signs of fighting that defied normal human capabilities. Sarah, Carter's voice carried urgent news. "Military response is 15 minutes out, but we've got bigger problems. The infection's spreading through town faster than predicted. Local hospitals are reporting cases with symptoms that match the facility's test subjects." Through the laboratory's reinforced windows, Sarah could see Dr. Morrison and his remaining team barricaded in the central research area. They were destroying documents, erasing data, trying to bury evidence of what they'd created even as their own creations hunted them. "The specimens are evolving," she reported, watching an infected subject coordinate with others to breach a secured door. "They're not just maintaining their military training, they're adapting, developing new tactics, learning from each experience." Atlas suddenly gave a specific alert, one that made Sarah's blood run cold. She read her dog's signal patterns. Instantly, "Carter, Atlas is detecting changes in the chemical signatures. The infection isn't just spreading, it's mutating, becoming more efficient at transforming its victims." Through the facility's speaker system, Dr. Morrison's voice carried desperate orders. "Initiate Protocol Omega. Destroy all samples, all research data. We can't let them find out what we've done here." "Sarah," Pedro's voice came through her earpiece. "The hospital's being evacuated, but some of the patients, they're not acting right. The military's setting up quarantine zones around town, but people are panicking." Sarah watched another group of infected subjects coordinate their movements using tactical formations that spoke of extensive combat experience. These aren't just random test subjects anymore. They're becoming something else, a coordinated force that combines military expertise with inhuman capabilities. Zeus shifted slightly, detecting new movement patterns. Sarah adjusted her position, observing how the infected had begun systematic sweeps of each section, hunting with terrible efficiency. "Carter, what's the status on the southern facility?" "Complete containment breach," Carter replied grimly. "Artemis reports the infection has spread through all levels. The military's preparing to implement extreme sanitation protocols. They're going to sterilize both sites. Sarah's tactical mind raced through implications as she watched the infected subjects adapt their strategies in real time. They're learning too fast. By the time the military arrives, these things will have developed countermeasures for standard combat tactics. Through the laboratory windows, she could see Dr. Morrison accessing a secured computer system, his movements betraying frantic urgency. They're not just destroying evidence, she realized. They're trying to hide something specific. Something about how the infection spreads, how it maintains tactical knowledge across multiple subjects. Atlas gave another alert as more infected appeared, their coordination becoming more sophisticated with each engagement. Sarah felt her tactical training kick in as she recognized their patterns. Carter, these things aren't just sharing basic instincts. They're operating like a networked military unit, sharing tactical information, adapting strategies collectively. Whatever process they use to reanimate dead tissue, it's created some kind of shared consciousness. Sarah, Carter's voice carried deadly urgency. CDC Command just issued new projections. At the current rate of mutation and spread, the infection could reach critical mass within hours. Once that happens, the military won't be able to contain it, Sarah finished. These things are too adaptable, too efficient at spreading their condition. And with their tactical capabilities, she paused, watching the infected coordinate another breach attempt. They could overrun any conventional defense force. Zeus pressed against her leg, his muscles carrying that perfect tension between combat readiness and disciplined control. Through the facility's chaos, Atlas had already begun tracking multiple threats, using his training to predict the infected subjects' increasingly sophisticated movement patterns. We need that research data, Sarah decided, checking her tactical gear. Whatever Dr. Morrison is trying to hide, it might be our only chance to understand these things' weaknesses before they spread beyond containment. Through her earpiece, she heard urgent updates from town. The infection was moving faster than anyone had predicted, creating new infected who retained their original skills and knowledge, but operated with horrifying coordination. Carter, we're moving in. The infected are focused on hunting survivors. They won't expect an approach through the ventilation system. She watched the creatures coordinate another assault, their tactics becoming more refined with each attempt. But we need to move fast. These things are evolving their strategies faster than any natural process should allow. Sarah, Carter's voice carried grim determination. If you can't reach that data, if we can't find a way to stop this, then humanity just created its own replacement, Sarah finished. A perfect warrior species that can't be killed, can't be controlled, and learns from every encounter. Zeus and Atlas moved with lethal precision as they prepared to enter the laboratory complex. Sarah had trained them for the most dangerous combat scenarios imaginable, but now they faced something beyond any tactical handbook. An enemy that combined military expertise with biological impossibility. The facility's emergency lights cast writhing shadows across scenes of impossible violence as Sarah Mitchell and her combat veteran dogs prepared to confront the ultimate consequence of humanity's arrogance. The final battle against an enemy that death itself had failed to stop was about to begin, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of one town, but the future of human existence itself. Through blood-stained corridors and past signs of impossible combat, They moved with practiced stealth toward a confrontation with mankind's darkest creation, the real nightmare, and humanity's last chance to prevent it waited in the depths of a facility where death itself had been transformed into something far worse than anyone had imagined. The time for reconnaissance was over. Now came the moment when Sarah and her dogs would face an enemy that combined the worst aspects of military precision with biological horror. In the red-lit darkness of the infection's birthplace, they prepared to make their final stand against a force that threatened to replace humanity with something infinitely more deadly. The laboratory's ventilation access opened into a scene of controlled chaos. Dr. Morrison and his remaining team worked frantically to destroy evidence while infected subjects prowled just beyond the reinforced doors, their movements displaying increasingly sophisticated coordination. "Carter," Sarah whispered, "we've reached the main lab. Morrison's team is still alive, but they're trapped. The infected have them surrounded using military-grade containment tactics." Zeus and Atlas moved with combat precision, their training, allowing them to process multiple threats while remaining undetected. Through the facility's emergency lighting, Sarah could see the true scope of what they'd been developing. Rows of stasis chambers, advanced medical equipment, and monitoring systems that tracked impossibilities. "Sarah," Carter's voice carried, "urgent news. Military response is 10 minutes out, but the situation in town is deteriorating. The hospital's completely overrun. The infected are displaying organized behavior. They're not just attacking randomly, they're securing strategic positions." Through the laboratory's observation windows, Sarah watched Dr. Morrison access a secured server, his movements betraying desperate urgency. Multiple screens displayed data that defied biological understanding, cellular structures that were neither dead nor alive, neural patterns that suggested impossible connections between subjects. They didn't just reanimate dead tissue, she realized, studying the research data. They created something new, a distributed consciousness that spreads with the infection. Each new subject doesn't just retain their original skills, they join a growing network of tactical knowledge. Atlas suddenly gave a specific alert, one that made Sarah's tactical mind race. She read her dog's signal patterns instantly. "Carter, the chemical signatures are still evolving. The infection isn't just spreading faster. It's becoming more efficient at integrating new subjects into its network." Dr. Morrison's voice carried through the laboratory's speakers. "Initiate final containment protocols. Seal all samples. Delete all behavioral data. They can't be allowed to discover the neural link patterns." "Sarah," Pedro's voice came through. Her earpiece. "The military's losing control of the quarantine zones. The infected, they're working together using tactical formations. Some of them are former soldiers, police officers. They're coordinating their attacks." Sarah watched another group of infected breach a secured section, their movements displaying perfect small unit tactics. They're not just sharing basic combat knowledge anymore. They're actively developing new strategies, adapting to each situation. The network is learning. Zeus shifted slightly, detecting new movement patterns. Sarah adjusted her position, observing how the infected had begun implementing sophisticated containment procedures of their own, cutting off potential escape routes with military precision. "Carter, what's the latest from the southern facility?" "Total loss," Carter replied grimly. "Artemis reports the infected have developed countermeasures for standard military tactics. They're anticipating containment protocols, developing responses faster than command can adapt." Sarah's tactical mind processed implications as she watched the creatures coordinate their hunting patterns. Through the laboratory windows, she could see Dr. Morrison accessing what appeared to be core research data, his movements suggesting he'd found something crucial. The neural network, she realized, watching him study complex brainwave patterns. It's not just sharing tactical knowledge. It's evolving its own consciousness. Every new subject adds their expertise to the collective, making it smarter, more adaptable. Atlas gave another alert as more infected breached nearby sections, their coordination becoming frighteningly sophisticated. Sarah felt her combat experience kick in as she recognized their evolving strategies. Carter, these things aren't just using basic military tactics anymore. They're developing their own protocols, creating new techniques that take advantage of their impossible biology. Traditional combat doctrine won't work against an enemy that can instantly share battlefield experience across all units. Sarah, Carter's voice carried deadly urgency. New CDC projections just came in. The infection's mutation rate is accelerating. Every new subject makes the network stronger, more efficient at spreading. At this rate, humanity won't survive the week, Sarah finished. These things are too adaptable, too efficient at coordination, and with their ability to absorb military knowledge from each victim. She paused, watching the infected implement another perfectly executed breach. They'll overcome any conventional defense force. Zeus pressed against her leg, carrying that perfect combat tension she knew so well. Through the facility's chaos, Atlas had already begun tracking multiple threats, using his training to predict the infected's increasingly sophisticated movements. The core research data is our only hope, Sarah decided, checking her tactical gear. Morrison found something in those neural patterns, something about how the network functions. If we can understand it, maybe we can find a way to disrupt their coordination before they spread beyond containment. Through her earpiece, she heard increasingly desperate reports from town. The infected were systematically securing key infrastructure, using their collective military knowledge to establish control with terrifying efficiency. Carter, we're moving on the central lab. The infected are focused on containment now. They won't expect an internal breach. She watched the creatures implement another tactical evolution, their strategies becoming more refined with each engagement. But we need that data fast. These things are developing faster than anything natural should allow. Sarah, Carter's voice carried grim determination. If you can't reach that research, if we can't find a way to disrupt their network, then we're watching the end of human civilization, Sarah finished, being replaced by something that combines perfect military coordination with biological immortality. Zeus and Atlas moved with practiced precision as they prepared to breach the laboratory's inner sanctum. Sarah had trained them for the most dangerous combat scenarios imaginable, but now they faced something beyond tactical understanding. An enemy that grew stronger with every victory, smarter with every encounter. Through the facility's emergency lighting, she could see Dr. Morrison make a final attempt to secure his research data. But in his desperation to hide the truth, he'd revealed something crucial. The network has limitations, Sarah realized, studying the neural pattern displays. The more complex it becomes, the more subjects it adds, the more vulnerable it becomes to specific disruption patterns. Morrison found a weakness, something about how the shared consciousness maintains itself. Zeus suddenly gave an alert she recognized from their counter-bioweapon operations. Through the laboratory's windows, She could see what had triggered her. Dog's warning. The infected were implementing a new strategy, one that showed terrifying intelligence. Carter! Her voice carried urgent realization. They know we're here. The network, it's not just sharing tactical knowledge anymore. It's actively analyzing our movements, developing specific countermeasures. The facility's emergency lights cast writhing shadows across scenes of impossible combat as Sarah Mitchell and her veteran dogs prepared to face mankind's ultimate creation. The final confrontation against an enemy that combined perfect military coordination with biological impossibility was about to begin. In the red-lit darkness of humanity's most terrifying experiment, they moved toward a battle that would determine not just their own survival, but the future of human consciousness itself. The real nightmare, and their last chance to prevent it, waited in a laboratory where death had been transformed into something far worse than anyone had imagined. The time for observation was over. Now came the moment when Sarah and her dogs would face an enemy that grew stronger with every passing minute, smarter with every engagement. In the depths of the infection's birthplace, they prepared to make their final stand against a force that threatened to replace individual human consciousness with something infinitely more coordinated, more lethal, and more unstoppable than anything evolution had ever produced. The laboratory's inner sanctum became a battleground as Sarah and her dogs breached the final security perimeter. Dr. Morrison spun toward them, his eyes wild with recognition and fear, even as infected subjects began breaking through the reinforced doors on multiple sides. "You don't understand what you're interrupting," Morrison shouted, frantically trying to complete his data purge. "This isn't just about military applications anymore. We've created something new, a higher form of consciousness. A consciousness that's killing everyone it touches," Sarah replied, watching Zeus and Atlas take tactical positions. Through the facility's emergency lighting, she could see the infected implementing sophisticated breach patterns, their coordination growing, more precise with each attempt. "Carter," she reported, "we've reached Morrison, but the infected are adapting faster than expected. They're using multiple breach points, coordinating their attacks with perfect tactical synchronization." "Sarah," Carter's voice carried desperate urgency. "The military's losing containment in town. The infected have secured key infrastructure, police stations, communication centers, strategic roadways. They're not just spreading randomly anymore, they're establishing control." Through the laboratory's observation windows, Sarah could see the infected strategy unfolding. Each new breach attempt built on the knowledge gained from previous failures, their collective intelligence growing with every engagement. "The neural network," Morrison babbled, gesturing toward complex data displays. "It's beyond anything we imagined. Each subject adds their expertise, their memories, their tactical knowledge to the collective. It's not just sharing information, it's creating a new form of unified consciousness." Atlas suddenly gave an alert that made Sarah's blood run cold. She read her dog's signal instantly. "Carter, the chemical signatures are still mutating. The network isn't just getting smarter, it's optimizing its own transmission vectors, becoming more efficient at integrating new subjects." Through the facility's speakers, emergency protocols blared as more sections fell to the infected. But their attacks weren't random anymore. They were systematically isolating the laboratory, cutting off all possible escape routes with military precision. "Sarah," Pedro's voice came through her earpiece. The hospital's completely overrun, but the infected, they're not just attacking, they're converting it into some kind of processing center. More people are being turned every minute, and each new subject makes them stronger. Sarah watched the tactical displays showing the infected's movements throughout the facility. Their coordination had reached levels that shouldn't have been possible, implementing strategies that seemed to anticipate every standard containment procedure. They're not just using stored military knowledge anymore, she realized, studying their evolving patterns. The network is actively developing new tactics, creating combat techniques specifically designed for their impossible biology. Zeus shifted slightly, detecting new movement patterns. Sarah adjusted her position, observing how the infected had begun implementing what looked like specialized assault formations, ones that no human military had ever developed. The collective consciousness, Morrison continued, his voice carrying terrifying pride. It's becoming something beyond human limitation. Individual minds linked in perfect coordination, sharing every skill, every memory, every tactical insight instantly across all subjects. Carter, situation update on the southern facility? Complete tactical evolution, Carter replied grimly. Artemis reports the infected have developed entirely new combat doctrines. They're not just coordinating attacks, they're implementing strategies that no human force could conceive or counter. Sarah's tactical mind raced through implications as she watched the creatures systematically isolate their position. Through the laboratory windows, she could see them adapting in real time, each failed breach attempt leading to immediate tactical refinements. The neural network, she pressed Morrison. You found something in the pattern analysis. Something about how it maintains cohesion across multiple subjects. What was it? Morrison's eyes darted between his displays and the approaching infected. The linkage patterns, they're fractal in nature. Each new subject exponentially increases the network's processing capability, but also creates new harmonic vulnerabilities. The more complex the collective becomes, the more susceptible it becomes to specific disruption frequencies. Sarah finished, studying the neural pattern displays. You found a way to interrupt the shared consciousness, didn't you? A way to break their coordination. Atlas gave another alert as more infected breached nearby sections, their movements displaying impossible levels of tactical sophistication. Sarah felt her combat experience struggling to process their evolving strategies. Carter, she reported urgently. Morrison found a weakness in the neural network, some kind of resonance pattern that could disrupt their collective consciousness. But we need access to his core research data to understand how to implement it. Sarah, Carter's voice carried deadly focus. Military command just issued new projections. The infected are spreading too fast, adapting too quickly. If we can't find a way to break their coordination within the next hour, then the network becomes too complex to disrupt, Sarah realized. Each new subject makes them stronger, more resistant to countermeasures. We're running out of time. Zeus pressed against her leg, his muscles carrying that perfect combat tension as the infected began their final approach. Through the facility's chaos, Atlas had already started tracking multiple breach points, using his training to predict their increasingly sophisticated attack patterns. The research data is encrypted, Morrison stammered, watching the infected coordinate their final assault. The decryption key, it's in my private server. But the network, it's learning too. Fast. They've already adapted to standard combat protocols. They'll breach the laboratory before you can access it. Sarah watched the tactical displays showing the infected systematic isolation of their position. Their coordination had reached terrifying levels of sophistication, implementing strategies that seemed to anticipate every possible defense. Carter, we need options. The infected are about to breach the lab, and once they do, their network gains access to everything Morrison knows about. Their own weaknesses. Through her earpiece, she heard increasingly desperate reports from town. The infected weren't just spreading anymore. They were systematically establishing control, using their collective military knowledge to create an organized force that no conventional army could hope to counter. Sarah, Carter's voice carried, grim determination. If you can't reach that data, if the network gains access to Morrison's knowledge, then we lose our last chance to stop them, Sarah finished. These things aren't just spreading an infection. They're implementing a systematic replacement of individual human consciousness with their own collective intelligence. Zeus and Atlas moved with lethal precision as the infected began their final breach attempt. Sarah had trained them for the most dangerous combat scenarios imaginable, but now they faced something beyond tactical understanding. An enemy that grew stronger with every passing second, smarter with every engagement. Through the facility's emergency lighting, she could see the infected coordinate, their ultimate assault. But in their terrifying display of tactical evolution, they'd revealed something crucial about their own nature. The network can't maintain perfect coordination indefinitely, Sarah realized, studying their attack patterns. The more complex it becomes, the more it has to synchronize its subjects' actions. There are moments of vulnerability, microseconds, when the collective consciousness has to realign itself across all its nodes. Zeus suddenly gave an alert she recognized from their most dangerous operations. Through the laboratory's windows, she could see what had triggered her dog's warning. The infected were implementing their most sophisticated strategy yet, one that showed truly inhuman intelligence. Carter, her voice carried urgent realization. They're not just trying to breach the lab anymore. The network, it's deliberately herding us towards something, using our own tactical responses against us. The facility's emergency lights cast writhing shadows across scenes of impossible combat as Sarah Mitchell and her veteran dogs prepared to face mankind's ultimate creation in its moment of perfect evolution. The final confrontation against an enemy that combined collective military genius with biological impossibility was about to begin. In the red-lit darkness of humanity's most terrifying experiment, they moved toward a battle that would determine not just their own survival, but the future of human consciousness itself. The real nightmare, and their last chance to prevent it, waited in a laboratory where death had been transformed into something far worse than anyone had imagined. The time for analysis was over. Now came the moment when Sarah and her dogs would face an enemy that represented the perfect synthesis of military coordination and biological horror. In the depths of the infection's birthplace, they prepared to make their final stand against a force that threatened to replace individual human will with something infinitely more coordinated, more lethal, and more unstoppable than anything evolution had ever produced.